The world's population has tripled in the last 70 years. Most of the global population and capital goods are now concentrated in urban areas. Cities have become central to social development and economic prosperity. Globalisation, urbanisation, and climate change are interacting in a way that is unprecedented, placing conflicting pressures on our natural environment and our urban service delivery systems. This obviously presents an urgent challenge to all of us, to politicians, to planners, architects, scientists, and engineers alike. And how are we, that community, going to create resilient, sustainable cities? So what is a sustainable city? Well, it can be defined as one designed with consideration of environmental impact, particularly in terms of minimizing the required inputs of virgin raw materials, energy, water, and food, and outputs of heat, air and water pollution, and wastes for disposal. So there's no completely agreed paradigm for what components should be included in a sustainable city, and that's one of the reasons why we're here today discussing this subject. But generally, development experts agree that it should meet the needs of the present without sacrificing the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So in today's session, we have a distinguished panel of experts, and they're going to explore and discuss the challenges, trade-offs, and innovative approaches that we are using to make urban systems more environmentally sustainable. We're going to discuss how we can create an enduring way of life across the four domains of ecology, economics, politics, and culture. Culture, very important, often forgotten. We'll discuss how cities may develop to allow people to feed and accommodate themselves, power themselves with renewable sources of energy, and provide efficient mass transit systems. We will discuss how we may protect such cities against sea level rise, flooding, natural and man-made disasters, heat waves, and the spread of disease. And we will discuss how we can ensure that these gains occur in a socially inclusive fashion, that generate socially inclusive, resilient cities, and of course that they're achieved in an environmentally sustainable fashion. So tonight we're going to hear initially from three experts who will deliver their keynote lectures. And that will then be followed by a panel discussion where we'll be joined by further experts. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first keynote speaker from the University of Southampton, Professor William Powrie, who is Dean of the Faculty of Engineering and the Environment and who will deliver his keynote, City Connections. William's main technical areas of expertise are in the geochemical aspects of transport infrastructure and sustainable waste and resource management. He was elected Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering in recognition of his work in these areas in 2009. William's work on geotechnical aspects of transport infrastructure encompasses groundwater control, in-ground construction to reduce environmental impacts in urban and other sensitive areas, understanding and mitigating vegetation and climate change effects, and fundamental soil behaviour. William, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks Ian for that introduction, and a very good evening to everybody. Thank you all for coming. So I'm really going to be talking about the connections to the city and how we support the city connections through engineering research. I'm going to say something about the rise of urbanisation, to which Ian has in fact already alluded, to point out that actually no city on its own can be sustainable, because we need a whole lot of engineering and other services in support of the city, and they have to be provided. And then I'm going to finish up by giving a few recent examples of ongoing research at the University of Southampton, which is supporting the sustainability of cities through enabling those connections that we need to keep the city going. So As Ian has mentioned, an increasing proportion of an increasing population of the world live in cities. So we can trace the graphic through from 1900, where it was about 20% of people lived in cities, right the way through to the present day, where it's about 50%, projected to rise by 2050 to 70% of the world's population projected to live in cities. And of course we have to bear in mind that that is an increasing proportion of what is in itself an increasing global population. So that's the reason why getting this sustainable cities thing right is so important. And it's not just the city. So if we were to look at, say, Greater London, it has a daytime population of something like 10 million, of which there are about 8.5 million residents, just over 1 million tourists, either from overseas or from the UK, day trippers and people there for a longer stay, 4.7 million workers, of whom some will commute into the city, but some will live there. And those are the figures for 2014, so they're probably bigger now. And if we think about the requirements of just that number of people, we're looking at 14,000 tonnes of food and drink every day, 1.64 million tonnes of water, roughly, 113 gigawatt hours of electricity, 168 gigawatt hours of gas, 10,000 tonnes of solid waste, and about 1.48 million cubic metres of wastewater. So all of this clearly is not going to be produced within the city itself. It has to be brought to the city, transported within the city, and then in the case of the waste and the wastewater, it has to be taken away. Transport then features very heavily in what we need of a sustainable city in harmony with its environment and its hinterland, so that we're looking in the case of London at perhaps 26.6 million daily trips in 2014, projected to reach 32.2 million in 2041, with 1.25 million people entering central London in the weekday morning peak. So the systems that we need to keep all of that going are an essential part of the sustainability of the city. So the city cannot survive on its own. It needs a relationship with its hinterland, and that has to support the production of food, water, goods and energy. We need to transport that food, water, goods and energy, and we also have to transport and treat solid waste and wastewater that is generated. We have to transport people, and those people need clean air, an increasingly important thing as many of our world cities are affected by frankly unacceptable levels of air pollution, and we now know that that contributes hugely to a lack of well-being, disease, illness and premature death. So the need for transport is very strongly evidenced by the growth of metro systems. So the top left there is the very familiar London tube map, which is probably one of the oldest systems in the world. But all around the world, Shanghai, Dubai, Singapore, Delhi, etc., we see metro systems being planned and built in a way that we're probably not very good at in the UK. And they're all essential to the business of moving people in and around the city in a way which is hopefully not going to cause too much harm either to the city itself or to the people who live there. I've talked about the hinterland of the city, and the way we support the City of London is that we have pretty well developed radial railway links. So the shaded area shows where you can get to by train in an hour from central London, and that's probably a sort of a commuting time that people are prepared to put up with. Southampton doesn't quite make it. You can get to Winchester in an hour, not quite Southampton, but going to the north you can get as far as Lichfield or Peterborough, and you can see there the effects of the high-speed line going out to Ashford in Kent. So that's roughly where you can get to in an hour from London, and that is an essential part of keeping the city going. So having said those few words by way of a sort of general background, I'm now going to pick up on some of the things that the University of Southampton in engineering, both its researchers, its staff, and also in some cases its alumni, have contributed to the development of those services that the city needs and the ways in which our research is still contributing. So clean air, from an engineering point of view rather than a medical point of view, there is at least one person here who is far more qualified than I am to talk about it from a medical point of view. But the wind flows in the city, the wind flows around the urban environment that we create, it's very important to understand those. Not just because gustiness in itself is important, it can affect structural loads and so on, but actually it's very important to the way that pollution is, if not generated, is moved around and dispersed within the city. So that our researchers in our aeronautics and astronautics department have developed the software which is used by many of the consultants in the UK in order to make those assessments. In terms of energy, you might remember that perhaps 6 or 7 years ago there was a bit of a fad for these micro wind turbines. So sort of you could actually go and buy one from B&Q. You could put it on your roof and it would generate free electricity, or not, as the case may be, because it turns out that the urban environment is generally completely unsuitable to such a device, and that actually you will probably not get back the embodied energy over the lifetime of the device. That was work that was done in the Faculty of Engineering and the Environment by colleagues Bakker Bahaj and Patrick James at the University of Southampton, and it changed our policy so that B&Q gradually took them off the shelves and they gave people a refund because it turned out not to be an appropriate solution. Of course, a big wind turbine is an entirely appropriate solution. You'll get back the embodied energy within just over a year, but it's a question of the right scale in the right place. And even these would have a role if you were looking at somewhere where it was difficult to get the grid connection. And then the fact that you wouldn't get the energy back wouldn't matter because it would still be a more cost-effective thing to do than to lay a special grid connection. So renewable energy has a very important role to play, but probably not micro wind in the urban environment. This isn't the urban environment, but it's a different form of renewable energy, which again, colleagues Patrick James and Bakker Bahaj are pioneering in Africa. Photovoltaic panels now form a very important part of our energy mix. We have a modest array on our garage roof at home, and it generates, last year it generated 4 megawatt hours. Yes, it's a sunny south, and yes, it faces south, but that's a significant amount of electricity. The work that we've been doing with colleagues from other universities about trying to predict future infrastructure needs, I think it's fair to say that nobody really saw this coming. If you wind back 10 or 12 years. Nobody really saw the huge contribution that solar photovoltaic energy would be generating to our energy needs. And the great thing about it is that it can be localized. You don't need to have it on a grid, especially if you can develop battery technology, which will give you the storage capacity. So that's a problem which is still being worked on. Noise is important. It's important to well-being. Many of our cities are underneath airport flight paths. So at the university over the last 20 or 30 years, we have been working very closely with Rolls-Royce to reduce jet engine noise. We're also working with Airbus to reduce airframe noise. Actually, the reduction in jet engine noise has been so successful that now it's when the landing gear comes down, when a plane comes into land, is one of the biggest sources of noise. And there's also a perception of noise. So interestingly, talking to Airbus, when they can see an A380 coming in, they think it's noisy because it's such a big plane. If you can't see it and you only hear it, actually people don't think it's so noisy. So perception of noise is also quite important. Railways are really a potentially very sustainable transport solution, but we see many objections to the reopening of new lines, such as the one from Marylebone to Oxford recently, on the grounds that people are concerned about the potential for noise. Night tube is great, although the problem is if you live close to a tube line, you might accept the noise between the hours of 6 in the morning and midnight, but when it goes on all night, it's really not great. So this is a rail damper which has been developed by colleagues in our Institute for Sound and Vibration Research. It's now marketed across the world and it helps to reduce noise which is generated in the rails and then radiates into the surrounding atmosphere. Structures are pretty important, and a long time ago, this is a mock-up, this is a micro-concrete model in our structural laboratory, all strain gauged up, and it's looking at the stresses in the then novel shell structure roof of the Sydney Opera House. That was supported by computational analyses using what was then the second largest university computer in Europe, and we still have the second largest university computer in Europe. It just has a lot more computing power now than it did then. And one of my colleagues, Stuart Moy, developed the analyses which helped prevent some of the early buckling failures of cooling towers. So cooling towers producing energy, an important part of the mix. In the early days, they would sort of have a buckling failure owing to wind-induced loading. That analysis was developed by Stuart Moy. And our alumni carry on this tradition as well. So Chris Wise led the structural design of the Millennium Bridge, And actually, when it wobbled a bit too much, it was the Institute for Sound and Vibration Research that got involved in the dampers, which managed to sort that problem out. And Jane, from whom we'll be hearing later, was responsible for the structural design of the London Eye. Transport infrastructure is important. So some work that I did quite a long time ago, these are the excavations for the Jubilee Line extension stations at Canary Wharf and Canada Water. So that shows you how long ago it was. But we were looking at the loads that come into these stripy things here, these temporary props which support the excavation during construction. At the time, there was a lot of uncertainty about how big these loads were. So we did some monitoring and some analysis and developed codes which have led to significant reductions in the amount of temporary propping that people need, and therefore a much more economical construction of these metro systems which are so vital to the city. Many of our railways, so thinking back to the diagram which showed how people get into the city to work, they rely on railway lines. Many of those railway lines were built in Victorian times. They're on embankments of uncertain construction. And the increasing demands of faster trains, more frequent trains, possibly heavier trains, and climate change mean that those earthworks can quite often fail, sometimes in an unpredictable way. So this is a particular slip at Stonegate in 2014, which was quite a bad year for some of these major earthwork slips. We've been developing ways of supporting and strengthening these earthworks through the installation of concrete piles. That's quite an expensive thing to do. So what we've been able to do working with colleagues in industry is to gradually widen out the spacing of the supporting piles, which help support the embankment. The benefits of that on the London Underground and the suburban network are reckoned to be something like 50% in terms of a reduction in cost and 50% in terms of a saving in time. And that's a direct benefit of research that we've carried out. We still do rely on a national grid. Even our photovoltaic energy relies on the national grid because most of it's not used at the point of generation. And there was a concern that with increased storminess resulting from climate change, the foundations of these pylons, which support the wires, would not be sufficient. They would not withstand the increased winds and the increased storminess. So we carried out, with my colleague David Richards, we carried out a programme of analysis and field testing which demonstrated that with the anticipated increase in gust loads, the foundations would be perfectly adequate, and that changed National Grid's policy on not having to strengthen them, and as a result, and there has been no failure in the UK as a result of increased storminess. We're also looking at ways in which we can modify ballasted railway tracks so that we can prolong the intervals between maintenance by a factor of between 3 and 10. And that means that we don't have the downtime for engineering works that we will other have. And again, we're working on that with Network Rail. And one of our most recent things has been, some of you might have heard of the Great Western Electrification Programme, which has gone about 3 or 4 times over budget, partly because of the over-design of the overhead electrification equipment. And I don't know whether this is, I don't know whether the secret plan is that we're going to put a motorway on top of this or something, but it does look like a very heavily over-designed structure. So we've been doing some field tests just completed last week to try to come up with more economical design methods so that we rein these structures back to something which is more sensible and more affordable. And then we can all travel on electric trains, which will have reduced pollution. In transportation, we now take this kind of information as we're driving along, whether it's delivered by a roadside sign or whether it's delivered to a passenger with a smartphone. We take this for granted, but all of this was pioneered by colleagues Mike MacDonald in the Transportation Research Group and rolled out across Hampshire as part of an EU project. And closer to where we are now, Nick Hansel has been working with Transport for London on bus prioritisation, so that when a bus approaches a traffic light, it will change to green, making bus travel in London more attractive and trying to woo people away from their cars. And waste. Waste is very important. We produce a large amount of waste. It's all generated in the city, and then it has to be either treated in the city or got out of the city. So Charles Banks and colleagues in environmental engineering have, over the last 20 years, taken anaerobic digestion, so that's the breakdown of biodegradable waste in the absence of oxygen to produce methane, which can then be used as a fuel. So they've taken that from something on the laboratory bench through a pilot scale to the government's preferred technology for treating this type of waste over a period of 20 years, having a very real impact on policy and benefiting those of us who live in cities and urban areas. The next step is creating higher density, higher energy density liquid fuels and other nutrients, so things like phosphorus or nitrogen, rather than fixing the nitrogen from the air, creating that in what they call a biorefinery, so that we're not limited to only producing methane from biodegradable waste. I should also mention the work that Ian's been doing on the circular economy, which is where we don't have a pipeline of goods and materials which are used and then disposed of, but we actually try to make sure that they're reintroduced for reuse or recycling into the economy at every stage. And so some great work has been done there with EU funding, which has rolled that out across a variety of industries. And again, some work that we did as something called the Infrastructure Transitions Research Consortium. We looked at future scenarios. What are the likely future needs of transport infrastructure, waste infrastructure, and all the rest of it? And we came up with with hindsight, rather obvious conclusion that the best way of saving money by not having to build waste management infrastructure is not to create the waste in the first place. And put like that, it does seem rather obvious. But the reality is that people will say, well, it's expensive to go green. It is expensive to respect the environment. This work shows that it isn't, that if you take a whole life cost view, the most cost-effective thing to do is to reduce waste, because you're then not having to spend money on the infrastructure to treat it. And that's quite a powerful message, which I'm quite sure that you could rinse and repeat for transport and all sorts of other things. And that's probably got to be the key to sustainability. We can't go on just consuming and think technology will take us out of it. Okay, so that is a quick canter through some of the contributions from engineering and the environment at the University of Southampton. Thank you all for listening, and I will hand over to Jane.
Thank you very much, William. Clearly, I'm not Jane. Oh, via Ian, yes, absolutely. So, you know, I work with these guys in the Faculty of Engineering and the Environment, and I think they drink tea and eat biscuits. And clearly, they don't. Clearly, they've done a wide range of quite extraordinary work, really, when it's all put together like that in 20 minutes. And you really can see the impact of research on changing our infrastructure and making our cities more sustainable. And it's great now to welcome one of our alumna, Jane Wernick, CBE, who is a structural engineer and director of Engineers HRW, who will deliver her keynote, Happiness and Wellbeing are the keys to making sustainable cities for living. So Jane, as I said, is a Southampton alumna and director of Engineers HRW, incorporating Jane Wernick Associates. She was with Arup from 1973 to 1998, and then she started and ran their Los Angeles office from 1986 to 88. And her most notable Arup project was, as William said, the Millennium Wheel. In 1998, she founded Jane Wernick Associates. Projects included the Young Vic Theatre, the Treetop Walkway at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, the Living Architecture Houses, and many institutional, cultural, and public realm projects. In 2015, James stepped back from running the business to concentrate on engineering and broader industry issues. Her practice was incorporated into Engineering HRW, a firm with a very similar ethos. Jane has taught at many schools, as well as doing her wonderful engineering work, including Southampton, Harvard Graduate School of Design, the Macintosh and Architectural Association. She won the 2013 CBI First Woman of the Built Environment Award. She serves on the design review panels of the Design Council CABE, Design Southeast and Camden. She was on the council of the Architectural Association and is a member of the multidisciplinary think tank, The Edge. She was a member of the REBA Building Futures steering panel, for which she edited Building Happiness, Architecture to Make You Smile. Jane, we're delighted to have you here today.
Well, Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to give you my thoughts about sustainable cities. Mostly they are based on my experience as a structural engineer working in London on projects in lots of different places. As a member of several design review panels and, as has already been said, a member of the multidisciplinary built environment think tank, The Edge. The built environment is a significant contributor to carbon emissions, both in construction and in use. And it's imperative that these emissions are minimised. The Edge sees part of its mission to be to get the professions to work together to find ways to improve the current situation. A few years ago, we organised a commission of inquiry into the professional institutions, chaired by Paul Morell, which resulted in this report, which urged the institutions to work together more closely to tackle the problems we face. Climate change is much more of a collective problem than an individual one. I would encourage you to visit our website to read more about the issues we address and try to bring into the public debate. Most of the issues that face us are not unidisciplinary. As professionals who work in the built environment, we need to be prepared to speak up as experts, that dreadful word, and work collaboratively with the huge range of other types of experts. As the terrible disaster of Grenfell Tower has shown, we must all be prepared to question not only our own work, but that of colleagues, clients, and stakeholders. This is such a huge and complex subject, so in this talk I will largely focus on housing in cities and as well as carbon emissions, we'll consider some of the broader issues of sustainability. I thought it might be useful to refer back, as Ian did, to the definition that Gro Harlem Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway and leader of the World Commission on Environment and Development, gave in her report in 1987. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We know that the climate is changing and that buildings are at least 40% of the problem. In the UK in 2013, we were told that housing alone generated 27% of the UK emissions, of which 73% was used for space and water heating. If we can retrofit our existing stock and make sure that our new buildings are much better insulated, we would have a chance to make significant improvements. What we decide to build now will have consequences for many generations. Some cities, such as London, do have plans for how they will develop and do indeed consider what their response should be to climate change, to social sustainability, to transport and to placemaking. All cities should do this and consider their particular needs. So a few years ago, I became interested in the newish discipline called the economics of happiness. Economists and social scientists were doing social research that showed that over the last 50 or so years, the percentage of people in the comparatively wealthy countries who say that they are happy with their life has stayed pretty constant, despite the fact that their financial wealth has increased enormously. The King of Bhutan said that we should measure the success of a society as much by using a happiness quotient as by measuring GDP. And the Swiss economists Bruno Frey and Alois Stützer have been writing about what economists could learn from happiness research since the late 1990s. I then read Lord Layard's book on happiness that carried out a wide-ranging review of the areas in which happiness was being studied. And at the time I was a member of, as has been mentioned, the RIBA think tank called Building Futures. We were looking at what might be happening in 20 to 50 years' time. And I proposed that we looked at how our built environment might affect our happiness. We actually decided that the subject was interesting enough to justify this book. It's a collection of essays by practitioners and researchers into the built environment, as well as some short pieces by well-known people about places that really do give them delight. I think it shows that there are many ways of thinking about what the effects of what we construct can be on the human psyche. A number of consistent threads emerge. People are happier if they feel engaged with how their local community is run. If the way we design encourages this, then so much the better. How we feel about a place is affected by many things. As the landscape architect Martha Short says, although a visit to the Grand Canyon is thrilling, her childhood memories mean that her backyard rates higher as a happy place. And there are benefits to being generous in the design of spaces that allow for social interactions. One case study that was included was the Bedzed development by Bioregional. It's a large-scale, mixed-use, sustainable community with a very low carbon footprint. Bioregional encouraged all the members of the design team to write a happiness plan at the start of the project. They decided that sustainability is the key to happiness. After it was built, they found that on average the residents say they know 20 of their neighbours compared to the local average of only 8. Other factors emerge from the essays, many of them common sense, such as students suffer if their rooms open onto long, closed corridors. And it matters if strangers can walk past your bedroom window. And of course, the physical conditions of daylight, warmth, and noise all play a part. In many ways, it seems that designing for well-being and happiness can increase the sustainability of our cities. There seems to be, however, a default position that we need to increase the density of our cities, and that the only way to do that is to build taller and taller. But is this really a sustainable solution? Perhaps building taller has always been an aspiration, and tall buildings have always been seen as a symbol of success and prosperity. I would like to argue that tall buildings, and particularly ones which are residential, do not increase the sustainability of large cities. Of course, we are constantly improving our techniques for making buildings that consume less energy and have a lower carbon footprint, but we can use these techniques for all building heights. So we have to compare the best tall buildings with the best lower buildings. Certainly there are benefits to a reasonably high density where we can have easy access to everything we need. We're all aware of the disadvantages of the lack of density around most cities in the US, where you can hardly live without every single person having a car. But the benefits are not linear, and over about 50 people per acre, the negative effects start to become apparent. So there may be a kind of optimum density where the streets are enjoyable to walk in, where the ground floors have cafes that spill out onto the pavement, and where the sun can actually penetrate to street level. This aerial view of Barcelona shows one of the most dense cities at 36,000 people per square kilometre. A while ago, researcher Serge Sala analysed various cities and showed that a city like Old Paris, which has buildings of about 8 to 10 stories, has a similar density to modern Shanghai, both at about 26,000 people per square kilometre. He also did research that shows that, as well as density, the morphologies of the building stock, how our streets are laid out, and the relative proportions of the buildings must be considered in order to get a balanced view of energy and carbon dioxide. His study, based on housing in Paris, showed that the shape factor, which defines the amount of exposed building envelope per unit volume, and the amount of the passive volume, i.e. the part near the perimeter of the building that does not require artificial lighting, are the most significant parameters in determining the amount of energy required. A high shape factor means that more energy is consumed. His study showed that, in fact, the comparatively low-rise layout of the traditional parts of Paris are much more efficient than the areas with high-rise developments in Paris. I heard Charles Correa argue many years ago in favour of low-rise density in Mumbai for achieving the most humane and sustainable development, with every bit of the interior and exterior spaces being used for living. It's not just density that we need to consider when we think about sustainability. A dense downtown business area, far away from a dense residential area, can be worse from a carbon point of view, because in that case, everyone is just commuting between two sets of tall buildings. Consider what's happening in Wembley, which is being built as tall buildings for people to commute to the centre of London. A less dense mix of the two, such as we see in Paris, where businesses and residential activities occur in the same area, can be much better. Also, having tall buildings in the city for the well-off doesn't necessarily increase housing density, as we know. Many of those people have second and third homes, and their population count must be divided between those properties. The best low-carbon cities are not those that are the most dense, but those which have a good distribution of amenities, are easy to walk around, and have good access to transport. So I don't think we can use density as the excuse to say we must have tall buildings. Please forgive this rant, it's going to carry on. This is important because there are many problems with tall buildings. In terms of the amount of building material and embodied energy, The taller the building, the higher the amount of embodied energy per usable square metre is required. This is because of the extra amount of structure that's required to resist the higher wind loads and the amount of floor area that needs to be given to vertical circulation of people and services. The effect is exacerbated in seismic regions where the lateral loads are of much higher proportion. A UK tower of about 50 stories uses about double the amount of structural material that would be required for a low-rise building. The net to gross floor area tends to be less, say of the order of 70% compared to 85% for a similar low-rise building. The additional floor plate required for lifts and services means that the facade surface area of the tower is larger. The amount of material required for servicing the building tends to increase with height as well. This is for higher lift requirements, more life safety requirements, extra effort for lifting water, extra ducting, etc. It's also less likely, sadly, that we can use timber the taller a building is, and that's a shame as timber is a very low carbon alternative structural material. In terms of energy consumption, unfortunately, very few recent UK towers have publicised their actual energy use. But it's likely that a tower, with its requirement for more lifts and the need to lift water, etc., would add about 10% of the electricity above that required for a lower building. Tall building has less beneficial shading from surrounding buildings. Excess daylight and radiant heat gains prompt users to lower glare blinds, which tend to stay down with the lights left on. Tall buildings tend to have deeper plans, which again leads to more lights being required. And higher wind speeds increase the need for heating if the insulation and ceiling aren't good enough. So generally, operational energy is expected to be 15 to 25% higher. In terms of financial costs of construction, maintenance and operation, they cost more to build per square metre than lower buildings because of the increased amount of material, the increased amount of plant, and also the cost of working at height. The UK's poor experience with residential towers was largely due to insufficient maintenance, with a lack of appreciation that they required higher periodic maintenance commitments and a proper plan for how the payment for this should be structured. In whole life terms, the cost could be double that per usable square metre for low-rise buildings. And regeneration is extremely costly and difficult. Conflict often arises between landlords, leaseholders and renters because none of them wants to foot the bill. This is something that we really haven't started to come to terms with. In London, the last 10 to 15 years has seen a huge increase in the number of residential towers being built, and we've yet to see how the long-term maintenance of these buildings will be handled. Tall buildings also have bad effect on their neighbours. The ground level wind effects get worse as they get taller and they don't get totally eliminated by canopies. They cast large shadows, which not only take away sunlight and pleasure, but block access to solar power. We need to introduce solar rights legislation, really. They also produce canyon effects, whereby pollutants from motor vehicles are trapped and concentrated at street level, reducing air quality. The population exposure to traffic pollutants in New York's urban street canyons can be up to 1,000 times higher than exposure to a similar quantity of emissions in other urban settings, such as Des Moines. And in terms of social sustainability, I should have done that one earlier. As they get taller, they also get wider, which makes the city less permeable at the street level. Clusters of towers can create dark alleys where concentrations of stagnant air and pollution can be found. The public realm also suffers from shading, as I've mentioned, but the psychological issues are also important. Many high buildings have a sad history with lack of maintenance, a propensity for crime and isolation from the ground. Those that segregate by income tend to form vertical gated communities. They bottle up activities that might activate the public realm at ground level. They do have an adverse effect on the mental health of those who live in them. This is particularly true in housing and especially for families with children. Crime and fear of crime can also be greater. The fact that the running and maintenance costs are higher is particularly problematic for those on lower incomes. In this age of cuts, it really can't make sense to saddle cash-strapped councils and the less well-off with buildings that are going to deteriorate if they're not maintained. And the Grenfell Tower tragedy is a terrible reminder of this. Those most suited to high-rise livings are young professionals, and those who suffer most are families. A sense of community and neighbourhood is difficult to achieve, and the lack of outside space is unhealthy for children. Even in flats with communal space and gardens, children are often not allowed to play in them without adult supervision, and that's pretty high from, say, 20 stories, 30 stories, 40 stories up. Now, I suspect that we will continue to build tall buildings, but sustainability requires that we create urban and cultural frameworks that allow us to have good personal interactions, provide places for chance encounters, take into account our ageing population, and most importantly, allow us to experience frequent contact with nature. In any wealthy society, what the rich family with children aspires to is a detached house with a garden. We need to find ways to provide similar outside spaces, both shared and private. Balconies are good up to about 10 stories, and setbacks can provide roof terraces, again, if they're not too high. Clearly, we need to find ways to build more housing. There are signs that modular off-site manufacture of homes is being revisited, which I find encouraging. And as Bill touched on, the circular economy concept of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is encouraging people to think more carefully about how and why we make things. Clearly, we need to try to reuse and retrofit our buildings much more. And there are many other issues that we need to consider, such as noise, privacy, connectivity, comfort, sunlight at street level, overheating, ventilation and cooling. Our climate in the UK is getting hotter, and we will need to do things like have movable external shades, as they do in the rest of Europe. These things all need to be thought about when we design. Well, I thought I would end with this optimistic slide. Cheongye-chung is a 10.9 kilometre long public recreation space in Seoul, South Korea. The mayor and future president of Korea, Lee Myung-bak, campaigned to remove the freeway and replace it with a park with a river running through it. It took just 29 months to do and was completed in 2005. Apparently, the number of car journeys for the city was significantly reduced and biodiversity increased. Perhaps it's time for us to think completely differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. What a wonderfully thought-provoking talk, introducing us to many different concepts, finishing with a very positive suggestion. And we love ranting. Don't apologise for ranting. Ranting is great. You know, science and engineering is built on debate and discussion. And of course, it's built based on evidence. And you produce plenty of evidence to back up your arguments. So that's what we want to see, people. Debate, discussion. Store up your questions for William and Jane and bring them later. So our third speaker, which I'm delighted to welcome to the lectern, is Richard Bonner, who is the UK Cities Director for Arcadis. And he's going to deliver his keynote, Sustainable Cities, Flourishing for All in the Face of Future Uncertainty. So Richard is the UK Cities Director for Arcadis, focusing on issues that cities face in addressing their challenges with sustainable urban development. Areas of market focus include housing, mobility, city resiliency and asset productivity, working with public and private sector clients and those in regulated industries, and also working with a global network of city executives. Richard has worked in a number of natural and built asset sector areas since graduating as a civil engineer. We like civil engineers. And has held a number of senior leadership positions with Arcadis in the UK. Richard is a non-executive director of Business West and the Bristol Chamber and Initiative, and an advisor to the property sector group of the West of England Local Enterprise Partnerships, and a business fellow at the University of the West of England, where I was external examiner for a bit, and we never crossed paths. But we have tonight, which is great, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the lectern.
Describe who Arcadis are, because many of you might not know too much about us. We're an international design and consultancy organisation, and one of the projects that we were very proud to be involved with is the Kingdom Tower in Saudi, which after your lecture, Jane, perhaps I shouldn't mention, but it's a kilometre high. That's going to be an incredible challenge actually for all those involved. But we like to be involved in many large global projects across many sectors. In fact, in London, we were talking about wastewater. We're involved with Thames on the new tidal solution and building a solution which will last for the next 100 years or so for London and their wastewater. Anyway, I'm going to talk about sustainable cities, and I'm going to reflect on why it's important that we have urban sustainability. As we have heard already, actually, there are so many different challenges that embrace the way in which cities thrive, whether it's about the way in which citizens live, how cities attract investment, actually how cities can deal with issues of their assets, how they create great places to live, how they work about the challenges that face them from sustainability, how do they deal with climate change adaptation, how do they live and create cities that are fair for people to live in. All of these issues we felt were quite interesting to look at in the context of the sort of triple bottom line, the issues of people, planet and profit. And so over the last 2 or 3 years, we've created what we call the Sustainable Cities Index. And I want to talk to you about some of the issues that we found as part of that agenda. So essentially, as you might gather, an organisation like ours, working in many different sectors and aspects across cities, has to have a point of view in terms of what makes a sustainable city. So we, with the CBRE, have conducted research over a number of years now in terms of what it means to tackle city from the perspective of people, so the social issues. What does that mean around well-being? What's that dealing with in the context of inclusivity? How are people accessing services, education, and how are people being able to thrive? We also look at the issues of environmental. So for many people thinking about sustainability, actually the sort of planet element, the environmental element, would very much be at the forefront of their thinking. So how does this work in the context of all of those issues to deal with green energy, the provision of access to water, dealing with climate change, dealing with those aspects. So that's the second lens which is really important. And then finally, the profit, the economic element. And of course, no matter how you look, and of course we all understand this, the economy of cities is really, really important. So actually, how are cities thriving through their ability to attract inward investment? How are they funding all of the sort of activities that we've been hearing and seeing about earlier on this evening? These are really important issues. So dealing with the economy, business, risk, infrastructure, finance, all of those things, we think is an interesting way of balancing a view in terms of what cities or how cities can measure themselves. So that was the scope of our research. And so leading on to, as I said, these sorts of areas. So 20 different indicators formed our city ranking. So I'll talk a bit about the cities in a minute. So we've ranked 100 cities internationally. And of course, there are important issues that get to the heart of why each city has a different set of challenges. I think what we found is that there's a really clear link between economic development and environmental sustainability. And I think in many respects, that would be a fair point to consider. It is our contention that actually you have to put people at the heart of all of your thinking. It's citizens who live in cities, and it's the way in which people are able to engage and embrace and have a fair life that is really, really important. And so in a sense, creating some of the balances between the economic stability of a city and its environmental sustainability is really, really important. And you can see some of those themes emerging in the context of what's happening in the UK at the moment. So if you look at the challenges around the sort of political scene on devolution, the sort of big issues are around how you can create economic balance across the country. So we know that there's a real significant tension between, for instance, the north and the south of the UK. And that's one of the reasons why we're creating these mayoralities and combined authorities. It's giving city regions the ability to actually create their own economic development that then allows them to think about how they can create environmental sustainability. And perhaps talk about a couple of those issues a little bit later. So it might be a little bit difficult to see here, but of the 50 cities that were perhaps towards the bottom of the rankings, you'll see in there a number of cities from East Asia. So I think we heard at the start that there are an incredibly a huge growing number of cities in China with significant populations, so real tensions. Of course, cities in perhaps Africa and Latin America feature towards the bottom of the rankings. So this creates a real sense of global fairness, actually. If you look towards the top of the rankings, then Zurich in our index featured right towards the top, Singapore second, London came in fifth, but there's not a lot of Northern European cities that feature very well in the rankings. And these rankings were based across the criteria of people, planet, profit against those various different indicators. So perhaps if I just talk about a couple of the issues. As I said, London features 5, but all of the UK cities that we looked at are in the top 50. So just featuring and talking a little bit about some of the sub-indices. From a people perspective, we have found, and I think it's really true, that actually low inequality is the secret to of social sustainability. So it's really important that actually we create equality for people in the way in which cities evolve and the way in which leaders in cities drive their policies and their solutions. Income inequality, and you can see that for many of those cities, is a real feature as to why cities perform badly. And that's not just a challenge in overseas cities. In my city, in Bristol where I live, actually we have the largest gap between the wealthiest and the poorest. And it's a real travesty that one of the 8 core cities in the UK has that significant gap across the city. And so these are issues that we have to really think about and we really have to address. From a planet perspective, well, of course, we heard a little bit about some of the energy superpowers and how they create some of the drains on resources and cities. And actually, for those large established cities, and think about some of the American cities, and Jane, you touched on New York, they have really significant issues in terms of cheap access to fossil fuels that are driving a very difficult challenge for them to address their environmental and sustainable perspectives. And it's perhaps some of the Northern European cities again that are able to think about how they can layer in alternative solutions, how they can layer in an investment towards shift to renewable solutions. And so those are real issues that many cities have to deal with, but they're all different in each of those cities. And then from a profit perspective, well, I think many cities clearly compete on a global scale. I think if you look at some of the ways in which the UK cities are starting to put their mindsets to the way in which they engage internationally, they're very focused on how they can create investable propositions to bring inward investment into the UK. If you look at London, in fact, the top 5 cities are all big financial investment cities. And even for the UK, in the face of what's happening with Brexit and what will happen to the future, I think many commentators are saying that London will remain a very strong centre of finance. But the same is not true in some of our other cities around the UK, and the same is not true for many other cities who face some of these challenges. So that ability to demonstrate that they've got balance in the context of how they're being able to raise funds to pay for infrastructure, the way in which they can balance and invest in dealing with climate change is a real challenge. And so those implications all feature around the profit agenda in our index. From the perspective of the UK, just to share 1 or 2 statistics and observations, London and Edinburgh both featured well. Both actually large financial powerhouses actually. And what's quite interesting actually, so they feature very strongly from that profit lens. Edinburgh has its own challenges that it features quite poorly in the context of people and planet. And so they're a city that's out of balance. They clearly have a certain degree of wealth in the context of the way in which Edinburgh operates as a as a city with all of the banking and inward investment perspectives. But actually many citizens are excluded from good housing, good quality schooling and good quality healthcare. So they are a city that on one level seems to perform well, but when you scratch through the indicators, have many challenges which you could argue mean that they are not necessarily a sustainable city. And I think that's one of the really interesting dynamics that we found, is that there's no one answer to this agenda, and actually each of the cities that we have studied have their own challenges. So here I think just really starts to underpin the difference actually in terms of London, which is really driven by its profits centre. But actually there's I suppose a sense of balance around the issues that our UK cities face from a people and planet perspective. But it's interesting that London is a global city, and Jane, I think you mentioned the London plan. So if you look at what's happened in London over the last 10 to 15 years, where we've had strong leadership, civic leadership through a mayor, it's been really interesting that the mayor has been able to articulate a vision around where people live, how the quality of people's lives will be affected by inclusion of green infrastructure, how the city will thrive through affordable and integrated infrastructure. And of course, very much at the moment, the whole issue of air quality. And we're finding those cities that have strong civic leadership are able to sort of shape their visions and start to think about how they can tackle these issues in a longer term way. I think I've really touched on most of those points actually, but it's just fair to say that the UK's cities feature in the top 38, top 40 cities. So you could argue that we would feature well, and I suppose that's an accepted part of perhaps where we are. But I think there's a lot of lessons that we see in the UK that we should be thinking about and should be applying to our thinking as an organisation, to the way in which we work with our markets around the world. But I think fundamentally it is our supposition that it's really, really important to put people right at the heart of your thinking when it comes to sustainable cities. However, there is constantly that tension between people and the environment, people and planet, and equally there's a tension in terms of people and profit. So, how do we think about the provision of fair services for citizens? How do we think about protecting people's homes from future climate change requirements when the costs are so significant? And so how do you start to think about creating ways in which you can invest and create value out of those investments that allow you to then fund them? And I'll talk about a city that's starting to think a bit differently actually, and starting to think about how they create value out of their investments in the provision of some basic needs to protect the city. So I'll move my discussion on from our Cities Index. It's available online. It's called the Sustainable Cities Index, and you're more than welcome to have a browse, and obviously clearly talks about the implications around a number of cities. But we're also very heavily involved in the area of city resiliency. And in fact, Arcadis are a platform partner of the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient City initiative, as are a number of other organisations. And so city resiliency, as defined by the Rockefeller Foundation, is the capacity of individuals, communities and institutions, businesses and systems within a city to survive, adapt, grow, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation have taken a really interesting leadership in this area. They are funding research across 100 cities to help cities to develop their own resiliency strategies. And this is, in a sense, giving leaders an opportunity to strip back their cities around the sorts of issues that we've discussed in our Cities Index and create sort of lasting legacies that deal with the ways in which they can prepare themselves for these sorts of issues. Why is it important for us as a business? Well, actually, in the business of design and consultancy, which is what we do, we see increasingly that the movement of cities to work together, to invest, to become more resilient, both in their physical buildings and infrastructure, but in the social and environmental areas and the economic areas, is really important. And it's £100 billion a year issue dealing with the consequences of climate change globally. So these are big issues, and they're the sort of big areas to tackle. So what's the impact on cities? Why do cities need to create resilient strategies? Well, of course, globalisation, the major significant trends that city leaders are having to deal with and their stakeholders is really important, actually. Urban planning, critical infrastructure, water management, climate change adaptation, risk management, the ability to demonstrate to inward investors that you've got the governance, the political leadership, and the security is really important. Of course, fundamentally, how do you ensure that you're saying to the business community that you've got a city that is resilient? These are all really challenging issues for mayors and cities to deal with, and so that's why we feel it's really important. So from our perspective, we see that the adaptation and resiliency strategies can be an accelerator for urban growth and development, and this is really important for our mayors and our cities and the clients that we work with in those areas. So it means that we have to start to think about the way that we deal with our thinking a little bit more differently. So you could argue that not just us, but cities and the stakeholders in them have to move from traditional thinking, where you might talk about flood management or water scarcity or green buildings or urban planning or individual projects, and think about it in a much more integrated way across the sort of complexity of the systems that operate in a city. So can you articulate your resiliency strategy? Do you understand the sort of socio and technical aspects to urban water management? Are you dealing across the different issues of climate change, earthquake resiliency? These are things that you have to look at together. Actually, what are the issues of water sensitivity, business continuity, and connecting projects between cities and across cities and actually into the hinterlands of cities are all really, really important. And actually there's a sort of sense across all of that there has to be some aspect of social justice to it all. And so these are the issues that are starting to guide city leaders and civic leaders in their thinking. So I want to talk very quickly about a couple of aspects of how cities have responded to challenges. So if you remember back to New Orleans and Katrina, and I'll take you very quickly to what's happened in New York post the big storm in post-Sandy. So New Orleans played it with a very blunt instrument in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So they had very clear leadership from the US Army Corps, and they had a very clear diktat. You had to achieve a 1 in 100 year flood protection by June 2011. And there was a clear and immediate budget of $14.5 billion to do that. And that was exactly what they did. They just built walls, levees, and repaired the infrastructure to create that, but without any thought really to the aftermath of what happened or to how it was going to lead to the value of creation, sort of creation of value, or indeed creating a resilient city. Whereas actually, in the context of New York, they looked at very much more at a holistic approach. So from the Dutch perspective of prevention to, I suppose, perhaps a more American approach of an investment, a quick investment. So here there's a combination between the flood prevention measures, protecting critical infrastructure, public transport and telecoms, but also starting to think much more about tailoring their resiliency measures to engage with businesses, buildings and communities. And also actually thinking about the long-term requirements to change their policies. So have they got the right building codes? Is their spatial planning acceptable to deliver a resilient city to the future? And do they think, and they think very clearly around how they educate their residents and others. So for anybody who's really interested, I'd commend you to follow Dan Zarilli on Twitter. He's a real advocate. He's the CRO, the Chief Resiliency Officer for New York. And New York, through the Rockefeller Foundation's program, were the first to develop their resiliency strategy. And actually, there's a whole issue of leadership, and for anybody who sort of follows this agenda and followed what happened with the Paris Climate Accord, I think that was the first time when city leaders from around the world came together with a common purpose. And if you've seen what's happened with President Trump deciding that perhaps the Americans didn't want to follow that agenda for his own reasons, actually the people who said no, we don't agree, the people who said we will actually solve this problem were the mayors. So Mayor de Blasio in New York has been very, very clear that New York will remain a resilient city. And I think actually, you know, this is why cities are taking so much more of a lead and are driving the agenda so much more thoroughly, because it's those city leaders who realise that they're responsible for the citizens. And who knows, you know, after a trip to Paris, maybe President Trump will come back, but I don't think that this will stop many American cities from carrying on with the great work that they've been working on. I won't talk too much about the way that they've responded, but they've had to deal with their critical infrastructure. That was fundamentally important because many aspects of it were broken in the aftermath of Storm Sandy. But they've led a very interesting piece of work, which is about rebuild by design. So this is about creating a resilient response to the way in which the city works. And we're working with many others on Lower Manhattan, rebuild by design, the big U. And actually what's really interesting is that as engineers, as many of us are, we're very much focused now on creating value out of the response to protecting Lower Manhattan. So typically the city in that area of town is very disconnected from the waterfront. There's no value created actually in sort of many of those aspects. And so as we start to put our strategies back together with others, we want to connect citizens much more closely to the water and start to think about how you can create value from it. So this is just an example that sort of demonstrates how you re-engage with the water but still protect the city. And actually there's a lot of value that's being created actually by creating land for economic growth, for housing, for business communities, but starting to think innovatively around how you use this space for, you know, for sort of additional use. So can you put car parks into those berms? And of course all these are things that we're very much starting to see as solutions. But this is all done in the context of community engagement. It's done at a sort of human scale level for the city, and I think that's a refreshing intervention in that particular city in their response. So I think in summary, our view is that actually for cities to be really truly sustainable, they need to put people right at the heart of everything that they do in their thinking. Cities need strong leadership. Cities need to understand what their issues are. Do they understand where they sit on that ranking scale and why certain aspects of their city perform less well? And they need people who can work across the system, people who don't operate in their silos but are able to collaborate across the different elements. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Very interesting to hear about the Arcadis Index and to see the rankings and to see how well British appear to be doing. And I think that some of the messages that you gave over reinforce some of the things that we heard earlier about the importance of people, about the importance of design. And I think the one thing that really struck me, perhaps more than anything else, was your comment about income inequality, which is not necessarily the first thing that people think about when they think about sustainability. But it really, brought home the importance of culture and society, as well as engineering and science and architecture and so on. So we move to the panel discussion part of the evening. So I'd like to ask the panel to come and join us at the table, please. And those of you who are excellent at maths will have spotted that we've gone from 3 to 4. And in fact, that we had intended to have 5. And Adam Reed, who was going to join us, isn't very well. So I know Adam will be watching. Hello, Adam. And I hope you're feeling better. And sorry you can't be with us. But the show goes on. And I would like to welcome to the panel Professor Stephen Holgate, CBE. And Stephen is the Medical Research Council Clinical Professor of Immunopharmacology. I've been practicing that all day. And
you can say it, I can't say it.
And he's also an honorary consultant physician at the University of Southampton. His current research focuses on stratified medicine, the role of the epithelium in orchestrating asthma, and the evolution of asthma across the life course. He's past president of the British Society of Allergy and Clinical Immunology and the British Thoracic Society. He's chair of the European Respiratory Society Scientific Committee. He's the treasurer of the World Allergy Organization and a member of the Medical Science Committee of Science Europe. And he co-founded Synergen, which is a publicly quoted respiratory drug development company with a focus on lung antiviral defense in asthma, COPD, and severe viral infections. And purely with my academic hat on, I'm aware that he has co-authored more than 1,000, I'll say that again, 1,000 peer-reviewed papers and has got a H factor of more than 100, which leaves me totally in awe. So if we just welcome Stephen to the panel, please. So now we've reached the point where we're about to probably to get the first awkward silence, whereas when I ask for the first question, who's going to be brave enough to put their hand up and ask the first question? I just remind you, can you say who you are and use the microphone? I'm going to come to the lady there in the middle. Thank you very much for being the first person.
Hi, I'm Claire Young. I work for a structural engineering consultancy and I'm an alumni from Southampton. I actually have 2 questions. Is that cheeky or...
Well, let's start with the first and let's see how we get on. Mind you, we like cheekiness like we like ranting, so that's okay. So,
okay, so the first one would be for you, Richard, which is how do you factor for size? So I had the privilege of growing up in Zurich, funnily enough, and whilst it is an incredible place, especially for waste and for transport, and they naturally have a lot of green, but that's just because they're penned in by mountains and they don't really have much choice. How do you factor in your ratings, compare that to London? Because the scales that they're working on, especially economically, are just so different, and the disparity between people's income as well is just, it's almost level compared to somewhere like London, for example.
Thank you. I think, putting together a sort of research piece that allows you to look across so many different indicators comes with 1 or 2 of its challenges for sure. So certain indices are pro-rated against sort of areas of population or sizes of population. But I think if you look at Zurich, it features very well across a number of the areas. So the sort of profit centre clearly is an issue. However, if I sort of scratch under the surface, perhaps issues of the sort of disparity issue, then that perhaps doesn't feature in our indices in terms of making a difference for Zurich. But what we've tried to do is take scale out where appropriate against individual measures, where that's been appropriate to pro rata. And of course, there's always a challenge with all of these things, but on a balanced view, independently verified, we felt that the outcome was the right outcome.
If I might just extend your question to the rest of the panel, and I'll ask Jane, if you wouldn't mind commenting on, because you talked about the optimised size, so I would like you to comment on that. William, could you say a few things about the infrastructure and scale? And Stephen, could you talk about maybe the health impacts and scale? So we'll come to Jane first.
Actually, I was talking about the optimised density as opposed to the optimised size. So, and that's not going to be the same number for every city, of course, but it is something to think about when you're designing or planning what you're going to do with your city, and to you know, if it's going to be an area where people can live and work in the same area, then I think you can get it to be much more dense. Whereas if it's, you know, I mean, London traditionally has been much more segregated, the living areas and the working areas, and so you have many more journeys going on as well. So it might be that the optimum number of people per hectare or whatever should be lower.
William?
Yes, I think that, and I think to some extent it's about what is your unit that scales. You could imagine that if you have a sort of unit which is reasonably self-contained, with people perhaps sort of living, working together, maybe even producing, that's unlikely with a city, then actually it doesn't really matter how many of those you put together. But then the penalty with that is that you don't get then interactions between the sort of self-contained areas. And clearly there's obvious issues, I think, with certain aspects of infrastructure. So, you know, there are some things, if you looked at, say, a waste plant or a water treatment plant, it doesn't work at less than a certain scale. But equally, if you look at, say, waste treatment, you know, actually people are sort of reasonably comfortable with having a waste treatment for the community, but they like it less if they feel that that waste treatment for the whole sort of county or region is arriving on their doorstep. And also, obviously, with transport, that different transport systems work at different scales. So at a smaller scale, cycling and walking work. Metros have a certain distance between stops, buses have a certain distance between stops, and then sort of heavy rail has a distance between stops. So it is, I don't think there's an easy answer. I think there's all sorts of things that you need to consider, and I think we've probably seen most of those mentioned today, but there's probably not a single answer like 42 or anything like that.
Stephen, what about health?
So, I mean, what's so interesting about humans and higher organisms is that the sense of wellness within a setting is cued by so many different inputs. And I think what's occurred in the last 3 or 4 years is that the biology behind wellness and illness is being understood. So rather than thinking of it now as a disease or not a disease, it's whether somebody can actually use the cues around them to increase their sense of wellness and move it on to well-being. So the whole mental health agenda, which is tied up with our urban environments, is connected with this biology. And we've got to try and understand what are the multiple factors that can raise the metabolic behavior of humans and the immunological behavior of humans towards a wellness sense. And because you get cities where you can be completely surrounded by buildings, but just because they're surrounded by buildings doesn't mean there aren't wonderful cues there that enable people to feel well and connected. And I think this is where in medicine we've gone really horribly wrong in the last 50 odd years, in that we've been very focused on disease without thinking of the multiple cues that actually create the context within which people live within their environments.
Brilliant, thank you. So, being as you were so cheeky and you asked such a good first question, we'll let you have a second one. Over to you again.
I turned it off, I was worried it wouldn't turn off on again. Second one was when you were talking about obviously the problem of places wanting to go up and that not necessarily being an optimal solution. I definitely understand that, but looking at retrofitting and reusing existing stock, because obviously if you're going to break down a big area, then you can allow for a park here and some gardens here, and you can kind of leave space for that. But if you're trying to work with something you've already got, how would you recommend providing more green spaces in, for example, London? We're lucky we've got big parks, but I mean more in kind of community areas.
We've got a lot of rooftops that we're not using, so I think there's a big win to have there. Because I totally agree with you, we do need more external spaces. Actually, we could probably attach quite a few balconies to existing buildings as well. So I think there's plenty of opportunities. And then, you know, there needs to be a bit of a political intervention, I feel, on all of these empty properties. And a lot of those do have very nice balconies.
And Stephen, what about the importance of green space for well-being?
This is just hugely important. I mean, we're very lucky in Southampton. We've got that ribbon that runs all the way through to the city centre and down towards the docks. So we're very unusual as a city, I think, to have all of that wonderful parkland. But one of the things that's very obvious in London is when communities take ownership of their local green space and use it in a way that becomes real to them, then the whole thing becomes not only an experience of green space and exercise and beauty, but it becomes a social environment where people can interact. And I think that's how we should move our green spaces, is to get the local community to try and take ownership and move it away from local authorities and all of that.
Could I
And,
come back?
yeah.
You reminded me of those brilliant projects that, like this, started in Los Angeles and other places in South America, where individuals have kind of adopted just strips of land and got local people to grow food and cook, and all sorts of other benefits have flowed from that.
Yes.
I think that's a really exciting thing.
Yeah.
I think people now started to talk about designing for place, where all of these issues are joined up, and I think actually the urban master planning has really started to embrace that issue, that the well-being issue, the inclusivity issue is only fostered by great sense of place. And you only have to look at perhaps some of the developments that are emerging in London. So my office is up at King's Cross, and I just reflect on what's happened there in the last 10 years since we moved in. And actually, there's a huge new square in front of King's Cross that was just an awful place to transit through, but that's now a sense of place of where people will stay and dwell and chat and communicate. And actually, that's happening in other cities. So New York's Dry Line, where they took an old piece of abandoned railway and created a linear park that's safe and green space for people to wander through the city, has transformed what sits around some very difficult parts of New York, actually. So I think, it's thinking about things differently. And devolution, so devolution is down to the citizen, actually. This is what it means so much, so that citizens are prepared to step forwards and take control over their little bit of their city and start to take ownership of the parks and put the little planting beds in and all those sorts of things. That's what devolution's about.
So William, how would you think about putting in place, from a civil engineer's perspective, the right kind of transport infrastructure? That, for example, rail and cycling are two of your big hobbies. Can how would you build that into a city but retain the green space?
Personally, I don't like cars, actually.
Second rant of the day, I think.
So you might have opened the floodgates now. So I've in recent years I've taken to cycling along some of the Sustrans cycle network, and a lot of that, or some of that, is on abandoned railway lines. And actually, there's a guy called John Grimshaw, and he produced a report on this, and it was really his pushing that set up the whole Sustrans thing. And when you've been cycling along there for a few days, and then you come up with a bit which is alongside some road, you realise how disgusting, how filthy, how noisy, and how totally unpleasant the internal combustion engine actually is. So my personal view is that I would like to really try to... ban is a bit extreme, but I think that if you could get rid of vehicle movements, especially internal combustion engine vehicle movements within cities, I think that would be a good step. And really try to sort of make sure that that you've got people walking, cycling, on ideally electric trains. So I was in Helsinki a couple of months ago, and there were very few motorised vehicles in the centre of the city, and it was just a pleasant place to be. It was clean, it was quiet, it was tranquil. There was just a sense of it being nice to walk and cycle. And I think there's got to come a point where we say, well, actually, a lot of cities that I go to, I think they're awful. They're just sort of high-rise concrete buildings that have got no character. And it's like it was your slide, wasn't it, of the expressway in Seoul that has been taken down. And just these double-deck expressways charging through the city. To take it down and put in the green space is absolutely fantastic. But it's a very, very bold mayor or a very bold community who will do that. But maybe one day it will come. And I actually think, whenever we do something with the built environment, we should improve on the natural environment. And sometimes that happens. You mentioned King's Cross, and there are some great places now. But so often, how often does a development, the only motive is the profit motive, and it ends up being awful. And if we could just do something to stop that, if we can actually step back and say, no, we don't need to drive our cars into the city and pollute the hell out of them, I think they would all be a much better place. Even coming in today, walking across Waterloo Bridge or whatever, you realise the filth that comes off most of the traffic, and that's what I would like to get rid of.
Great.
Fantastic. So we've got a cheeky question igniting the panel. So I'm going to come to this young lady here next. You can say who you are and use the microphone, please. And then there's a load more questions that have emerged. Great.
Hi, my name's Sally. I'm from the Climate Group, just across the river, also a Southampton alumna. I'd like to thank you for making your speeches just earlier. I have a question that you've already kind of touched on in some way or another about governance and leadership, and I was wondering if across all of these studies that you've done of cities, if any particular political system came out as something that would push the sort of sustainability of a city. I've lived in cities all my life, basically, and for example, a system in Beijing, which is very different from that in London, where sometimes people say that there's a Beijing weather machine that sort of clears the pollution away whenever it's required. Is there anything on a political level that seems to work in perhaps in the social side of things? Also, is it better to just leave it to sort of the market, sort of let it be market-oriented or community-driven or community-led?
So we'll start with Richard, because you've touched on that one, I think. Yeah.
Well, I think, if you just look at a couple of examples, actually, so it's not just about the sort of politics of democracy in many respects, because if you've touched on, different cities have different issues. I think it's those cities that are starting to understand they've got issues to grapple with. So in Paris, the current mayor has sort of come to to deliver a significant change where they are now banning cars from a part of I think it's the west bank or the east bank of the Seine. It's taken them 15 years to get to that position, but they've started to really understand that allowing citizens to walk without diesel engines and all that sort of stuff is a big challenge. But that's taken 15 years of strong leadership to get to a point where suddenly there's a real step change in thinking. And I don't think it'll take the Parisians very long to realise the true benefits of what's been happening. I think there's another interesting dynamic, actually. So there's an organisation called Grosvenor, who are many will know, a sort of big landowner and developer. They've created their own research around resilient cities that looks at where they make their international investment decisions. And one of the big issues in there for them is the whole issue of governance and consistency. And so they want to invest in cities that have many different positive aspects around sustainability. But it's really important that there's clear governance that is true. And actually that's a really important factor, I think, in terms of where people choose to make some of those investment decisions.
So, Stephen, you must have dealt with a few politicians in your time. What do you think about the role of politics?
And some of them are actually very invigorating. I mean, Sadiq Khan is a leader, and I'm not Labour, so he is somebody who stepped up to the podium and is going to do something. And he's decided to do it, and he's going to do it. So he's a politician, what I consider that has got the people working with him. It's the sort of politics that we kind of haven't had for a long time in this country. And it's refreshing because he's bold, he's ambitious, he's going to do things that are going to benefit the people living in this city. Maybe he's got more money than they have in Manchester or Liverpool or, northeast of England. But nevertheless, I think if we've got leadership like that can demonstrate they can do it locally within the system, within one city, then maybe others would rise up then and say, look, it can be done. So let's do it, because, to me, the car is the worst possible enemy. It's an extension of the house. It has nothing to do with transport. It's a sexual object. It's a place where people have music. They camp in, do all sorts of other things inside their vehicles, which I won't go into details of. But I mean, the last thing it is considered as a fire under a metal bonnet. And if you look at the adverts, the way cars are sold, it has nothing to do with transport, or it's to do with the image and the extension of your home, basically. So we've got a job to do, I think, politically, to get people to not see the world through the windscreen any longer and to take a different view on life. And I mean, to me, health should trump wealth, in my personal view. And the fact that we've got obesity going up now, the mortality, as you heard a day or two ago, is now beginning to fall off again with age because of the rise in these non-communicable diseases, all of which are being contributed to by this dreadful four-wheel vehicle. So I think politics has got a huge amount to play. I don't have examples beyond this country, which obviously members of the other panel do, but I do feel boldness is now needed. And when I heard Macron was going to introduce electric cars, I think, by a certain date, well, I mean, that is a step in the right direction, let's be honest, isn't it? And whether he achieves it or not, I don't know. But.
Okay, well, I know we've got a lot of questions coming, so I'm gonna zip around. And I just would like to comment on political leadership. If you think about the Irish government, they led in the banning of paper bags, plastic bags, sorry, and banning smoking in public places. And they're a tiny little country, and it just goes to show what bold leadership can happen. So, gentleman there, please.
I'm glad you went to me, because my question really follows on from that. So we're all agreed that there's this need for quite a strong state intervention at a municipal level. And I think in this country there's certainly been an attempt in a small number of cities to actually bring that power back to the municipal level. But that's been against the background, really, of a very strong centralisation movement. And when you look at the real power, where the real power is in budgeting, local authorities have consistently had their budgets undermined over the last few years. And do you feel confident that there's the power and the expertise now at local level to actually deliver any of this, or is that the most important step that we need to make towards sustainable cities, is actually putting the power and the budgets behind it at the local level?
Okay, I'm going to ask Jane and William to comment on this question, please.
Well, I mean, it's a very difficult question, isn't it? I mean, hand on heart, I'm not so confident. And one thing that goes through my mind is that it's clearly very difficult to run a local council. And if you're lucky enough that there are people who have the time to do it and the training and the ability, I'm talking about the councillors now as opposed to the employees, then you're very lucky. And so I'm not quite sure how we can address that properly. It's because we don't really want the people who are making all the decisions just to be the people who happen to be independently wealthy. They're not representative. So I think we really need a proper debate about this.
William?
So again, I mean, very much a sort of a non-expert point of view, and I won't go off on a rant. But I think there's something, part of the answer is I think, at a small local level, if you look at one of the things that I said, that every time you make an intervention into the environment, it should be for the benefit, I think the answer is actually no, because I think the trouble is that those are kind of quite low-level local decisions. And I think that local authorities are under such huge pressure. But I think the positive part of the answer is that for something which is a big ticket item, such as Ian mentioned the plastic bags or the banning smoking in pubs or public places, and again, actually trying to drive the car out, I think that if you had just one bold person, not necessarily in a big place, who could do that in a way where they took the populace with them, the benefits of that would, I think, be so obvious that you would then see other people following suit. So I think that the answer is kind of twofold. I think that if it's something which is big enough and bold enough to get visibility, then I think there is hope. But it's probably almost going to be a random thing that happens where you get the right person in the right place at the right time with the right following, and it works. Because sometimes an idea can be too far ahead of the curve, and so you don't want that. But then I think that if it's something which is more like business as usual, I think that is much more difficult, because even if you get great practice in one place, it becomes much more difficult for that to get the oxygen of publicity, which would then see it rapidly replicated.
Okay, gentleman over in the corner there.
My name is Renaud. I studied in Southampton many years ago, and I actually heard a lot today in relation to how much frustration we have in terms of improving the city and so on, etc., etc. And following on to the point just has been made that if someone or somewhere is bold enough to do something, other people will follow. So if I were to say that I actually have a piece of land, which is like 4,000 acres in the UK, and I'd like to start a new city, how much support you guys will put into it, into the design of it? And that's why I'm here today. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
All right.
Well, we didn't see that coming, people, did we?
Okay.
Wow.
So all those are here, and where do I go? And this is real.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start with Arcadis, and then I'm going to move across. Okay.
Perfect. Well, I think you've got many experts here, so we can have a little conflab afterwards. But I think you make a really interesting point that there is a real housing crisis in the UK, and there's a real sense that actually this is not just about tinkering around the edges. This is not just about the densification of cities. There are some big decisions to be made around creating new urban environments, new garden cities, new garden villages. The government are really looking hard at this agenda in terms of how they can release public sector land to do that. So MOD bases, health hospitals, all this sort of thing. And the government are really focused through some of their agencies to bring those sorts of land holdings forward in the right framework. There's all sorts of issues around planning policy context and other challenging issues, but there's a general sense we have to move in that environment. It's challenging, though, to actually create those as sustainable new extensions, and so there are several that are going to pop up around Cambridge that you're probably familiar with. One or two good examples of where that's starting to emerge in very sustainable ways in terms of accessing the city. I suspect there'll be one or two disappointments in years to come, and that's what we have to fight hard to avoid.
Stephen, how are you going to help Renaud with his piece of land?
One of the big mistakes, I think, that has happened looking back is the fact that infrastructure is not put in before the housing and other things. So what tends to happen is that the housing and things goes up, the roads and but then the schools, the general practice, the parks and all that is all sort of secondary. And I suppose what I would like to see in response to your question, sir, is the public themselves, the people who are going to live in that community, sit down with those capable of designing it with the question, what would you like your community to look like? And then have what I would call a grand challenge, which is to let the designers and all the rest of it actually try and put something in place that fits the financial model that obviously you probably want to roll out. But not just get the housing companies to come in and just build. And Southampton's a very interesting place. I mean, we've got tall buildings in Southampton that were put up in the 60s and 70s. And if you go into those neighbourhoods, there are kind of cul-de-sacs. There's only one road in. There's no way out. There's only one way of getting in to the and so you wonder why children aren't sort of going out and cycling, because they can't get out. They're absolutely trapped within this extraordinarily poorly designed area. So I would like the public to play a much greater role in the planning, if I was giving any suggestions.
Okay. It's a positive suggestion for you. William?
So obviously our activities are primarily education and research. We have students, we have expertise and enthusiasm, we've got some ideas, no doubt. I think Stephen's answer and idea is great, and I think that's absolutely something which a place like a university could help with. Yeah. We can run student projects, we have group design projects, so depending on your time scale, obviously we're locked into an academic cycle, and you will get some good thinking. So I think there's things that we could do. It would probably be an ideal group design project for some of our fourth year students.
Absolutely, certainly would, yeah. And Jane?
I agree with this, having a student design project. I think it's a great thing to do. I also think it's good to do that in parallel with a team of professionals also working on the same project. And I just want to tell a story about a really fantastic landscape architect who I know and work with sometimes, called Joe Gibbons. And there's a site that's been derelict and will eventually be built on opposite Dalston Station in East London. And they just spent years, they spotted this site, she and her practice, and started talking to local people about, some people would just sit there and drink and all the rest of it, but they want to know all the people who inhabited the buildings around this back of, behind space. Quite a large area it was. And gradually they just put together, the local residents, with Jo and her firm's help, a proposition to the people who own those buildings and who own the land. And it's a temporary project. It might only be there for 10 years, but it's fantastic. It's got a cafe, it's got most beautiful park in it, basically, but with all sorts of corners in it, and the local people are so proud of it. So it's not being, you know, hurt or vandalised at all. So I would so definitely say you have to start by involving, you know, that's already been said, that all the people who may be the users or the neighbours of your area, and you know, I as an engineer, structural engineer, I always love being involved in the projects right from the beginning. A lot of my work I get from helping on design competitions or master plan competitions even, right from the beginning. So you get all of the different expertises brought in at a very early stage. Because actually, as professionals, we all love treading on each other's toes and making suggestions of, you know, I talk about the architecture and the architect will talk to me about the structure. And so if you get a good team together, then you'll get brilliant conversations, and then you can get all the engagement.
So there you go, stakeholders, bottom up, students. What do you think of all that?
All of that very useful, and the only thing I have is that in terms of residents, there are some, but this is not a highly populated area. It is effectively 4,000 acres of land.
So the first thing will be to say, where are the people going to come from? What kind of people might they be?
Well, that's precisely what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Because I can't disclose the
No.
place, obviously.
Oh, we'll just go there.
Because we're in the course of assembling the land. We have done quite a bit already. And obviously we have a team of professionals doing that. And the transportation and infrastructure is already very, very good. Because I'm sort of looking at cities, and you're talking about in 2050, 70% of the people is going to live in cities. And looking at what you were talking about today, we're just doing a repair job of all the city trying to do something. I'm talking about if we are going to create a city and say this is what the modern city may look like, and if we are successful designing it, it's almost like this is a scale model, which could possibly be, because if we sort of keep on growing, you know, like Rockefeller, whatever foundation they call themselves, and they say, let's look at growing a city. Is it all about growth? Does it actually mean that London may have to stop growing? You may have to actually build other communities. So one, you stop the urbanisation, and second, you say, what is the optimal city, optimal building, optimum size? In terms of sustainability, in relation to all the supply of energy, food, everything.
So you've raised a number of really important points, and what I'd like you to do is to interact with the panel during the break, and everybody else. There he is over there. He's the man with the land. Have you got some ideas? Please go and talk to him. Now, I've got a few more burning questions. I'm going to come to this gentleman here first, and then I'm going to take one more question, and I'm going to end up with the youth of today, I think, as being the last question. That gentleman there, last question. So over to you, sir, first.
Thank you. My name's Tony. I'm an alumni of Southampton, and I think, Reno, your question's already been answered in the Wilson Economics Prize for 2014. But I'd like to ask the question of the panel. Sustainability, like charity, often begins at home. Does the panel have any views as to the UK government's planning policy, the NPPF, and its housing white paper, as to how they should be changed to produce a sustainable city which doesn't act like an unstoppable cuckoo on the surrounding towns and villages within an hour's travel?
Okay, so that's a very specific question. I suspect I should start with Richard.
I mean, so the housing white paper deals with a number of strategies, actually, and I think accelerating delivery is one of those, creating the right policy framework. So many cities are now going through that whole agenda around where do they want to make their compromises, if that is the case. And I think actually what it is going to lead to is much more holistic planning in terms of any encroachments that may occur, and then a move towards creating housing in a sustainable way around the. You think that's the case? How do you change it? But how do you change the white paper or policy? The policy? Well, I think this is going to be driven. So this whole devolution agenda is giving local mayors, combined authorities, the opportunities to start to influence the policy across their area. So I'll talk about my own city of Bristol just for one moment. They're creating their joint spatial plan, which for the first time will look across the 4 authority areas. It's looking at a strategy for infrastructure investment over the next 30 years that creates sustainable investment from a transportation perspective. So it is led by, as we've talked about before on a number of occasions, mayors and civic leaders who are saying, we want a bit of that control, thank you very much. And we will start to impose some of those strategies. Now, there's all sorts of contexts of conflicts, but actually it will be driven by those leaders lobbying the politicians in Whitehall who will do it. So I genuinely believe that giving more control to city regions and the mayors that sit within them, give them much better connectivity to the needs of their citizens, and therefore we will get a better outcome.
So I'll come to Jane next, because I'm sure you have a view. And then William and Stephen, if you want to chip in, then please do afterwards. So, Jane?
No, I don't think I do have a specific view on that.
You wouldn't want to change the policy, the NPPF, or the housing white paper to generate more sustainable cities?
Well, of course I would, but I can't tell you how. No.
There's another angle to the white paper, which talks about the growth of the SME market. Actually, that's a really positive play. So the housing white paper talks about bringing much more of the local small individuals to be part of the solution for creating housing. So we, as consultants and as city leaders, have got to think about the way in which we embrace supply chains which are focused on mass house builders, actually.
With respect, SMEs wouldn't drive a solution of the scale that Reno needs.
No.
Well, actually, that's not necessarily completely the truth. So if you go to, I'll give you an example, in Cherwell District Council, they've got a large slug of housing land, which is all about self-build, actually.
Yes.
So they've created solutions where they want self-builders to come in, and they're putting the infrastructure and the...
That's
and
for
the
individual houses, with respect. It doesn't cover sustainability across the whole city.
So I think this is an absolutely fascinating debate, and what I'd like you to do is to interact with the rest of the panel. And again, you heard the question from the gentleman. Please go and interact with Tony. And clearly, he's passionate about this particular piece of regulation. Okay, in that case, well then you can put your views forward to the people who are interested, and let's have debate and discussion. That's what this is about, really. So we're going to come to our very last question of the session. We'll go to this young gentleman here. Don't forget to say your name and to take the microphone. Okay, off you go.
My name's Owen Williams, and you, William and Steve, you were talking about how terrible the car is and how wonderful it would be if everybody walked and cycled to work. Now, as great as that sounds, I highly doubt that's going to happen. So our best bet is the electric car. Mm-hmm. But so let's say everybody in London has an electric car. Now, those cars need to be charged, and then there's a population of 6 million in London. I highly doubt the electrical grid will be able to cope with that. I'm not sure if any of you will have an answer to this question, but do you know how we could stop the grid from overloading?
Richard, we'll come to you.
And
then William.
Okay. I'll sort of cast a little bit further forwards than just what we're sort of seeing with Tesla in the here and now. Actually, what I can see will be happening in the next 5, 10, 15 years is that we won't own cars in the way that we currently own cars. What we will be doing is we'll be starting to see city transportation using electric vehicles that are connected and autonomous. And you'll use your app and you'll book in and you'll want to go from here to here. And the first mile of that will be an electric vehicle that will just turn up and drive you to the tube station where you'll then head off on your journey. So car ownership is going to change significantly. The motor manufacturers are dealing with this issue. They're recognising that we no longer want to buy one vehicle solution. You might start to do leasing solutions that mean that you get the vehicle you need for your need. On that, so you're going to IKEA and you get a van. You're going away with your family and you get a larger car solution. And these things will turn up for you on the day that you need them. So the whole market around cars is being significantly disruptive, and technology will change the way in which we own and use cars significantly over the next 10 to 15 years, is my view.
William, this is one of your areas.
I did quite deliberately resist saying that the electric vehicle was the solution, because I think one of the things that Stephen said, actually what it doesn't solve is this problem that you're in a pod which is an extension of your own personal space, which I think is not a particularly desirable thing in societal terms. And I think the other point is the point that you make, that actually we have not got a hope of generating, if we were to try to switch everything from petrol to electric tomorrow, the infrastructure just isn't there. And it is a well-known problem. So it's I did mention the Infrastructure Transitions Research Consortium. How do you transition the infrastructure? So, when we started to do, for example, recycling of waste, you've got to fix a number of things simultaneously. You've got to get people to sort their waste from the house in a different way. They need to put different things in different bins. You need to change the collection system. You need to change the way that the waste is dealt with and processed once it all gets to a central system. And then you need to create markets for recycled goods and things. It's almost impossible to put all of those things in place. And you've got the same problem with electric vehicles, that if to switch to electric vehicles, you need charging stations, you need to be able to generate the electricity. An interesting point is that I talked about our photovoltaic array. Actually, a lot of that goes into the grid because it's generated during the day when we're not at home. But if I did have an electric car with a big battery, that's an ideal way of storing that energy. And I also think that the solution that you mentioned is absolutely right. We're going to have just think about, nearly everybody owns a car, and probably 95, 98% of the time it's sitting in a garage or on a drive or in a car park doing nothing. That is a huge amount of asset which is tied up. And I bet you that the motor manufacturers are thinking it's going to completely revolutionise their business model. So, prediction is difficult, especially when it involves the future. And I'm not going to make a prediction, but I think that a mixture of all of the things that we have heard about, a complete revolution in personal transport, it's all on the cards. Electric vehicles will have a role to play, but it's also true that many people jump in the car and drive half a kilometre around the block when actually they should walk or cycle if they're able. And so I think that actually encouraging walking and cycling and communal forms of transport, as well as the individual personal way, it's all part of a solution. And that's a system that we can probably guide people to. So going back to the prediction is a mug's game thing, a lot of what we do is on the basis of predict and provide. You will never provide enough. You build a motorway and more people use it and it's clogged up in essence. So actually, I think that when it comes to the future, we should decide what we want it to be and create it. So rather than predict and provide, we should decide and create. And it's actually people like all of us here who are interested to turn up tonight who should decide what we want to happen, and we should make it happen. And actually, you as the youth, as the future, there you are, there's a challenge.
So Jane, I'm going to give the last word to Stephen after Jane.
Well, thank you very much.
Stephen, I'm going to Jane first.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought no, that's fine.
I just want to add another issue we have to deal with. Particularly in London, people are travelling far too far to get to work because they can't afford to live in London. So we have to we have to come up with a political solution to this, and a financial model. We have to change the financial model when it comes to housing, because we can't afford for all those people to be using all that fuel, whatever it is, to be travelling into work from the outer reaches of the city.
It ain't going to be free.
No. So we've got to reduce the amount of journeying that we have to make and use the longer journeys for pleasurable things.
A great point. And Stephen.
Yeah, well, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but somebody mentioned Helsinki early on. I mean, when the wall came down, Finland was at the bottom of the European League for Health in all categories: cancer, cardiovascular disease, lung disease, the whole thing. They're now at the top of the league, and they've achieved that in 40 years. I mean, that is spectacular, and it shows you it can be done if the will is there. And they had the will to do it, and they did it. So I don't see really that this is an insoluble problem. I think it just needs, as you say, that level of ambition to tackle the whole issue and not try and fix the margins, because that's not going to get us to where we want to get.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had an absolutely wonderful start to our University of Southampton Public Lecture Series for 2017, and this one on the theme of environment. I apologise to the people who really wanted to ask a question and I couldn't get to you because we've run out of time and I've overshot anyway, for which I hope you'll forgive me. However, you still have about 45 minutes or 50 minutes to collar some of the panel. I'm sure they won't mind being collared too much. And of course, to talk amongst yourselves. To talk and spread the word about the issues that we've talked about today, about how we develop a sustainable city for the future. So will you join me for one last time in thanking our wonderful panel for their fantastic talks and their contributions. Thank you.